When I began, years ago now, to focus on the power of love as a healing force, no one really disagreed with me. Yet what they continue to accept in their daily life is lovelessness, because doing the work of love requires resisting the status quo. In Thich Nhat Hanh's most recent treatise on the subject, True Love, A Practice for Awakening the Heart, he reminds us that to love, in the context of Buddhism, is above all to be there. He then raises the question of whether or not we have time for love. Right now, there is such a profound collective cultural awareness that we need to practice love if we are to heal ourselves and the planet. The task awaiting us is to move from awareness to action. The practice of love requires that we make time and that we embrace change. Fundamentally, to begin the practice of love, we must slow down and be still enough to bear witness in the present moment. If we accept that love is a combination of care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect, and trust, we can then be guided by this understanding. We can use these skillful means as a map in our daily life to determine right action. When we cultivate the mind of love, we are, as Sharon Salzberg says, cultivating the good. And that means recovering the incandescent power of love that is present as a potential in all of us, and using the tools of spiritual practice to sustain our real moment-to-moment experience of that vision. To be transformed by the practice of love is to be born again, to experience spiritual renewal. What I witness daily is the longing for that renewal and the fear that our lives will be changed utterly if we choose love. That fear paralyzes. It leaves us stuck in the place of suffering. When we commit to love in our daily life, habits are shattered. We are necessarily working to end domination because we no longer are playing by the safe rules of the status quo. Rules that, if we obey, guarantee us a specific outcome. Love moves us to the new ground of being. This movement is what most people fear. If we are to galvanize the collective longing for spiritual well-being that is found in the practice of love, we must be more willing to identify the forms that longing will take in daily life. Folks need to know the ways we change and are changed when we love. It is only by bearing concrete witness to love's transformative power in our daily lives that we can assure those who are fearful that commitment to love will be redemptive, a way to experience salvation. I'm always grateful for the wisdom and power of bell hooks. I would be remiss today if I didn't start my sermon by defining some terms. When I talk about listening today, I'm not talking about something that necessarily includes our ears. I mean listening as the act of intentionally receiving communication. This includes uses like, I saw the warning sign, but I didn't listen, or I'm listening for the still, small spirit to guide me, or I slept in because I was listening to my body's needs. It's a kind of listening that includes situations like receiving a text from a friend that has had a hard day and replying, I'm here, I'm listening. We are all capable of listening, regardless of our actual sense of hearing. And furthermore, being able to physically hear doesn't automatically make us good at listening. While we're at it, I'll define what I mean by wholehearted. I think this word made it into my vernacular due to the works of Brené Brown, who is a social researcher and one of the preeminent voices regarding the impact that shame has on our lives. Her framework of wholeheartedness revolves around, quote, the capacity to engage in our lives with authenticity, cultivate courage and compassion, and embrace the imperfections of who we really are. For me personally, I tend to respond to somatic frameworks, which means I tend to locate feelings and ideas in my body and build out from there. This makes wholehearted a powerful word for me because I know that wholeheartedness feels like here. I can apply the concept to actions like listening by floating situations through my mind and noticing when they are connected to that full heart sensation. So we have wholehearted here and listening, the act of intentionally receiving communication. But communication is also not as simple as it seems. It is such a core human function, and yet the more that we learn, the more we discover about how complex communication really is. It's complex in every layer, from the physics to the philosophy of it. But what I really want to bring up today is how communication is interpersonally complicated. You see, communicating is all about passing information from one party to another, and we do that using symbols. Words are symbols. Gestures are symbols, and those symbols are useful because they have a meaning attached to them. So when we communicate, we're trying to get the meaning behind our symbols into another person's skull with as little data loss or confusion as possible. And this is where it gets perplexing. Picture this. Imagine person A is writing a letter to person B. Person A, against all odds, is so meticulous and creative that they chose exactly the right words to frame their ideas, and they seal the envelope on the most perfect letter ever written. A job well done, correct? Well, no, because we have only accomplished half of the task, because person B still has to receive the letter, read the letter, and interpret it in all the same ways that person A intended it to be interpreted. Even the slightest variation in interpretation, whether from differences in dialect or life experience, results in some amount of data loss, and the meaning changes. The slight mismatch between intended meaning and interpreted meaning is present in every single conversation that takes place between human beings. As galling as it is to think about, you can never say anything and know that your meaning was clear. And you can never hear anything and know for sure what was meant. The only way to guarantee that you are correct is to approach all communications with a measure of uncertainty. Only by accepting that we don't know do we begin to know. When it comes to listening to one another, there are a number of pitfalls that can get in the way. The first, as you can infer from the last part of this discussion, is assuming clarity. And the second is also a slippery monster of a concept. In professional circles, it's usually called transference. The closest thing to transference in everyday language is probably projection. Essentially, it's where the person that you're with reminds you of your sister-in-law or your neighbor or the kid who sat in front of you in 5th grade, and you subconsciously treat that person differently because of the relationship that you have with the person that you're reminded of. Transference happens to everybody. It is a natural part of the human psychological structure to recognize patterns and to use them to inform our actions and our reactions. It can be tricky, though, because if that kid who sat in front of you in 5th grade used to bully you, then your reactions to a person that reminds you of her might default to the defensive. Your lens of interpretation has become toned by the hostility of a dynamic which is no longer present. Your nervous system might even prevent you from exploring the questions that you would usually ask, because it associates this interaction with a dangerous person, and therefore it perceives danger. In order to truly listen to someone, we have to be open to asking a lot of deep questions about the true meaning of their words. And we have to be willing to be wrong. And neither of these is the state of mind most conducive to surviving a threat. So it's extremely difficult to listen well while in a threatened state. Transference can work the other way too, however, motivating us to special levels of compassion. If we are subconsciously reminded of someone we love, then we are likely to be inspired to interpret the other person's communication through a lens of familiarity. This can also happen even if the person doesn't particularly remind us of someone, but the situation does. Say you are listening to a neighbor describe their struggles with an ailing spouse. It might remind you of what you went through when your own partner was sick. Your heart might really go out to this neighbor. This ability to relate can create a very special connection of comfort. However, you might also be reflexively filling in their story with details from your own experience. Or you might find yourself assuming that what was helpful to you then would be helpful to your neighbor now. And this has the potential to be a little bit less of a useful connection. So if transference is such a normal occurrence, then what can we hope to do about it? The good news is that a little awareness goes a long way. If you are able to get into the practice of saying, that friend reminds me of my aunt, it gives you a little bit of distance from the association. It can give you the spaciousness to notice if your inner reactions are being distorted by that dynamic, and that spaciousness might free you up to go back to asking questions, to go back to curiosity. Now, yet another thing that serves as a barrier to wholehearted listening is perhaps the hardest to work with, and that barrier is fear. There are all sorts of ways that fear prevents us from listening, and sometimes that fear is very warranted and very understandable. I am afraid to hear speeches from transphobic politicians because I am afraid about how angry and sad it will make me. My friend is not willing to listen to her ex-partner who treated her poorly because she's afraid of it drawing her back into old emotional patterns. It is okay to set a boundary around not listening to someone if you are not trying to sustain a conscientious relationship with them. But when we do want to be in relationship with others, we have something of an obligation to listen well to each other. And sometimes that means facing our fears. Here are some reasons why we might feel resistance to listening to each other. And I should mention that I have at some point experienced every one of the fears on this list, so if they hit a little close to home for you, just know that you're not alone. I am afraid that I won't be heard when it's my turn to share. I am afraid that I will get bored. I am afraid that things are going to change. I am afraid that I will lose track of my own understanding of the situation. I'm afraid that I'll be proven wrong. I am afraid that I will have a strong emotional reaction which will cause discomfort to me or others. I am afraid that others will have a strong emotional reaction and I will feel responsible for keeping the peace. I am afraid of setting boundaries if this conversation goes in an undesirable direction, and on and on. And many of these fears are about control. And it's true, an uncomfortable element of deep listening is the need to release control. Control over what is said, control over the outcome, even control over the conversation's pace and length. To release control, we have to practice listening with less ego and less attachment. As UUs, we believe in every person's inherent worth and dignity, and sometimes the biggest challenge in that belief is to include ourselves. To truly accept that our own worth is inherent, we must accept that no interaction with another person can be a threat to that worth. Letting go of control in the conversation does not put our dignity at risk. Finding out that we are wrong can't possibly damage our standing as humans. When we stop fearing these existential ideas about ourselves, we find the means to escape from shame. And when we escape shame, we get access to wholeheartedness. There is no greater sense of freedom and no greater truth of dignity than to connect with others from a place of humble certainty and unshakable centeredness. It is a powerful gift offered to each of us each time we have the opportunity to have our minds changed and our worldview expanded. The feeling of wholehearted listening is embodied. It supports the deeper breath. It pulls us to lean in, and it clarifies the gaze. It is a beautiful feeling on both the giving and receiving ends. And the hardest part for me to accept about all of this is that this feeling is not always going to be accessible. I can aspire to it, I can practice it, I can use it as a guide, but some days I will not be able to reach it. And what matters most when wholeheartedness is inaccessible is that we don't blame ourselves or punish ourselves for that. We can only do the best that we are capable of doing in that moment, and then we resource ourselves and we come back and we keep trying. So this week, my blessing is that we may all experience the gifts, both of listening wholeheartedly and of being listened to in the same way, with courage and openness, with awareness and the willingness to be wrong, with curiosity and releasing of fear and control. Let us engage again and again with this indispensable tool for building community. And through it, let us find ourselves changed. May it be so, and amen.